Hi, this is Jennifer from Read It Again. Come sit with me while I read part 1 of The Silver Thread from the Unicorn Secret series by Kathleen Duey. Please consider subscribing, and if you enjoyed this book, hit the like button and share this video with all your friends. Heart shivered on a high ridge. The sun was rising over Lord Dunraven's vast forest. She couldn't see the village of Ash Grove or the Blue River, but she knew where they were. A long day's walk straight east on the Dairytown Road. Heart stretched, shaking off her dream. Every night in the woods, she'd had the same one. In it, she was always running. Something was chasing her. She woke every morning to the sound of forest birds singing. Her pulse would slow, and her fear would fade. Heart sighed, looking down the slope. The trees spread out in every direction. Lord Dunraven's forests really were endless. Heart wondered, as she did every morning, if Tin Blackaby's men were searching for her. They had seen her running away from Ash Grove. But how important was a ragged girl with a scarred mare and a spindly colt? Would they care where she went? Heart had stayed away from the Dairytown Road. Both Avamere and Moonsilver were white, after all. Any sharp-eyed traveler might spot them. Heart glanced at them. From a distance, they did look like any mare and colt. They weren't, of course. As strange as it still seemed to Heart, they were unicorns. Unicorns! Heart smiled. No one back in Ash Grove believed in unicorns. Even though everyone knew the legend about the town's name. It was an odd story. Storytellers said a unicorn had touched the Blue River with her horn. The water had exploded into steam so hot that the grove of ancient oaks on the bank had fallen in piles of ash. Simon Pratt had thought the story was foolishness. Ruth Oakes had said no one believed it anymore. Heart had thought it sounded like someone's fancy. Now she wasn't so sure. She glanced at the unicorns. Avamere had lost her horn somehow. Her face was scarred. Moonsilver was beautiful now, but he had been born small and skinny. He'd had an odd-looking bulge on his forehead when they'd run from Ash Grove. Heart had been worried the first time she'd noticed the small, bloody split in Moonsilver's skin, until she realized it was his horn pushing through. It was growing fast now. The colt rubbed his forehead on trees constantly, trying to ease the itching and stinging. Heart blinked as the sun edged above the distant mountains. She missed Ruth Oakes so much. Ruth had started teaching her about herbs and healing. She had even paid Heart to help her with her work. Not that the coins do us any good here, Heart said aloud. Heart missed Simon in odd ways too. Her eyes filled with tears. Simon had not loved her. But maybe he had never loved anyone. He had fed her and taught her, and for that she was grateful. But he was cruel. If he had gotten his way, the unicorns would have been slaughtered for a few pennies. If Simon had known Avamere and Moonsilver were unicorns, though, he'd have sold them to Tin Blackaby instead. Heart shivered. If Blackaby learned the truth, he'd send 100 men into the forest. He'd try to capture the unicorns so he could sell them to Lord Dunraven. And if Lord Dunraven ever finds out that you're unicorns, he'll have 1,000 men searching, Heart said aloud. The only way to stay safe was to stay hidden. She changed camps every night. She kept her cook fires small. Avamere shook her mane and made a low whickering sound. Moonsilver cantered to stand close beside his mother. He was wilder every day, more independent. He had rubbed off the braided rag halter and lost it on their first day in the woods. Now he wouldn't let Heart touch him very often. Heart's stomach growled and she sighed. The barley she had brought from Simon's house was more than half gone. She was trying to make it last. She saw rabbits and squirrels, but had no way to hunt them, and winter was coming. Soon it would snow, and the grass would be buried, and they had no shelter from the cold. Hart kicked at a loose rock and listened to it rattle its way down the slope. The mare looked up and went on with her grazing. "What should I do?" Hart asked the sky. The chilly nights came and went. Every day Hart searched for shelter and food. Then, one misty morning, she saw a shadow at the base of a cliff. After a long moment, she began to walk up the mountainside. Avamere lifted her head from grazing as Hart passed. "Maybe it's a cave," Hart said aloud. She was getting into the habit of talking to Avamere. She knew it was silly, but it made her feel less lonely. Avamere whickered at Moonsilver, and they followed as they always did. Hart waded across a clear little creek. She slowed, coming up out of the little valley. She was afraid to hope. Moonsilver galloped in wild circles. He leapt from one boulder to another. Hart smiled. No horse colt ever leapt like that. No horse colt ever could. Moonsilver snorted, ducking his head to arch his neck. Avamere leaped sideways, startling him. He bolted into another boulder-jumping circle. Hart smiled. Avamere was such a good mother. "I think it is a cave," Hart whispered. She held her breath, pushing her way through a patch of deer brush. There was an opening in the rock. Avamere slowed, her ears pricked forward. Caves made good homes for bears, Hart knew, and wolves. Avamere held her head high. Moonsilver stayed behind her. Hart was ready to run at the slightest sound. But there was only the silence of the forest. In front of the opening in the rock, Hart laid one hand on Avamere's withers. They stood still for a long moment, listening. Then Hart picked up a handful of pebbles and tossed them into the darkness of the cave. The pebbles hit and rolled to a standstill. Then there was silence. Hart set down her sack. The silence continued. She dug through the things she had brought from Simon Pratt's house. Near the bottom of the bag, she found the 2 stubbed candles. It took several tries to strike a spark into a little pile of dry pine needles. Once they were burning, Hart lit a candle wick. Her pulse thudding. She protected the little flame with one hand. "You stay here," she said to Avamere. The mare blew out a breath and twitched her tail. Hart started forward, every muscle in her body tense and ready. Just inside the cave, she stopped, blinking. The candlelight flickered in a golden globe around her. Beyond it, there was midnight darkness. Hart took one more step, then another. The cave was big, much bigger than she had dared to hope. She had taken 16 steps when her candle's light finally struck a wall of gray stone. Hart lifted the candle, looking straight up. The rock arched pretty high. Avamere would be able to walk without lowering her head. The floor was gritty with sand and pebbles, and it was dry as salt. Hart allowed herself a hopeful smile. She would gather firewood every day until they had enough. She would cut grass and dry it as much as she could before the first snow settled in. And she would manage, somehow, to build a gate across the entrance to the cave. "We will be safe here," she said aloud. Her voice sounded hollow and strange. She felt a sudden wrench of loneliness. But why should she be any lonelier now than she had been in Ash Grove? Only 3 people there had ever really talked to her. Simon had ordered her around. Tibbs Renner, the knacker's son, had found ways to be mean to her. Only Ruth Oakes had been her friend. Hart turned back toward the entrance. Avamere and Moonsilver were waiting for her. "It's wonderful," Hart said to Avamere. "Dry and warm and bigger than I thought." The unicorn mare blew out a long breath and flicked her tail. Then she came forward lightly. Moonsilver was right behind her. Heart walked downhill with the unicorns every morning. Once they had found a meadow with good grass, she set about her own chores. There was so much to do. Heart swept a rock shelf in the cave and dried the grass and herbs upon it. She gathered grass and firewood. She found pine nuts and acorns and stored them. She gathered purslane and cress to eat. She built a fire ring of flat stones. She dragged in a wide log to sit upon. And everywhere Heart walked, she looked for fallen branches. She searched for long, straight ones. At night, by firelight, Heart worked on her gate. Using sharp sticks and a knife she had taken from Simon's house, she dug deep, narrow holes. When each hole was finished, she set a branch upright in it. But before the gate was finished, she ran out of barley. "I can eat pine nuts and purslane for a while," she told Avamere one afternoon. The white mare shook her mane. She switched her tail sharply. "I've dried a lot of grass for you," Heart said. She reached out to lay her hand on the mare's neck. Moonsilver was galloping in wide arcs as usual, playing. "But I have to go back to Ash Grove to buy food before long," Heart whispered. She knew Avamere couldn't really understand, but she needed to say it anyway. "I'm afraid to go back," she admitted, "but I want to see Ruth Oakes. She'll worry." Avamere tucked one forehoof on a pebble, and it rolled ahead of them. Then she shook her mane and cantered away. Heart watched her gallop, then slow to a trot, then stop in a patch of tall green grass. A breeze rising from the valley below rustled the leaves. Heart looked down the slope toward the tree-hidden road. Maybe she should follow it toward Derrytown, not back to Ash Grove. Derrytown was 20 times the size of Ash Grove, people said. No one would know who she was. No one would notice one more poor girl. "Look there!" Heart stumbled to a stop. It was a man's voice. Not close, but not too far away. Whirling around, Heart scanned the trees. "Is that a white deer?" a second voice called. "Can you see it?" Heart followed the shout with her eyes and spotted a movement in the trees far downhill. A tiny bit of red flashed among the branches, then was gone. A hunter's cap? "Moonsilver!" Heart whispered frantically, starting to run. The colt had been cantering joyously. Heart could tell he had heard the voices. He was scared, turning sharply to start back toward his mother. He galloped toward a fallen log, then rose to jump it, his forehoofs tucked with a dancer's grace. Avamere whickered anxiously. Then the air was torn by a terrible shriek. For an instant, Heart was sure the scream was human. Then she ran. She imagined one of the men doubled over a sprained ankle. Then she saw Moonsilver pitch to one side, the beautiful arc of his leap ending in a crashing fall. Avamere lunged into a gallop, her hooves light and nearly soundless on the soft forest soil. Heart dropped her gathering sack to run faster. "Can you see it?" The voice was closer, echoing among the trees. The hunters were coming through the thick forest, making their way up the rocky slope. "No," came the curt answer, "but I hit it. You heard it cry out." Heart ran harder, holding her ragged skirts with one hand. If they got close enough to see Moonsilver clearly... As Avamere plunged to a stop beside her colt, Heart veered to run almost straight across the slope. She sprinted, reckless and desperate. She glanced back twice. Once she was sure that the unicorns were well behind her. She let out a high-pitched wail. "There it is! Hear it?" came a shout. "It's heading north," the second voice accused. "You only wounded it." The men's voices were still far down the mountainside, so far that Heart realized something as she ran. To hit Moonsilver from that far, they had to be using crossbows. Ordinary village men hunted with short bows. Lord Dunraven forbade any other weapon. Only his own men were armed with crossbows. Heart put every ounce of her will into running. She ignored the stab of sharp sticks and rocks bruising her bare feet. She let out another trailing scream as she ran, then fell silent again. Breathing hard, she heard the men shouting behind her. Good. They were following her now. Heart ran desperately, pounding through the thickest stands of trees to keep the men from seeing her. She screamed again over her shoulder. After a long time, Heart veered to the east. She circled, leading the men farther and farther from the unicorns. Finally, she slowed, then stopped, dragging in gasping breaths. Silent and careful, she found a tall tree to climb. Breathing hard, she waited high in the branches. The afternoon light was fading. The forest was thick with shadows. The men passed close enough for her to hear what they were saying. "I saw it clearly before I shot," one deer hunter insisted wearily. Insisted wearily. "It was a snow-white deer." The other man laughed. "I'll bet it was an old gray pony some gypsy let loose." "An old pony wouldn't have made it this far," the first voice argued. Heart waited until their voices had faded away. Then she slid down the tree and doubled back. The sun was setting. How long had she been away from the unicorns? Was Moonsilver still alive? The thought that he might not be struck her with a pain so deep that for a moment she could not draw in a breath. Heart made her way back through the forest. Fear weighed her feet and chilled her spine. When she saw Moonsilver standing beside his mother, her spirits leaped upward. But then she got close enough to see the blood streaming down his hind leg. The arrow lay half buried in the dirt on the slope above Moonsilver. It had cut a long gash on his right back leg, just above the hock. Moonsilver's wounded leg would not bear his weight. He stumbled against his mother, then stood trembling. Heart found her gathering sack where she had dropped it. She tore the soft cloth into wide strips. Then she looked intently at Avamere. "Tell him he has to let me do this," she pleaded, wishing the mare really could understand her. Avamere pawed the ground uneasily. "I have to bind it," Heart said, trying not to cry, trying not to stare at the blood staining the pine needles. She talked to Moonsilver in a low, murmuring voice. Moonsilver looked at Heart. His eyes were distant, glassy. She could tell he was in terrible pain. She risked a single step forward. Moonsilver lifted his head sharply, but didn't move. She took another step. Avamere reached out to touch Moonsilver's back with her muzzle. The colt twitched his skin, then held still. One more step and Heart stood beside him. She reached out very slowly, placing her hand gently on his neck. Heart paused again, giving Moonsilver time to calm down. Then she slid her hand along an inch at a time. The colt stood still. Heart pressed the cloth against the wound. Moonsilver had his muzzle almost on the ground. He swayed a little as she wrapped the strips around his leg. Heart glanced up at the mountainside. It was getting darker and chillier. Suddenly, Moonsilver fell forward onto his knees. Heart rushed to put her arms around him, holding him upright. Avamere came close, whickering low. Heart pulled Moonsilver back up. He could barely walk. Still, he managed to start uphill. He had to stop every few steps. When they finally reached the entrance to their cave, he stumbled inside. Heart staggered along, helping him, finally letting him sag to the sand near the fire ring. She built up the fire and warmed creek water to wash the wound. The bleeding had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. The wound was deeper than she had thought, much deeper. Once it was clean, Heart tightened the bandages a little. "We need Ruth Oakes," she said to Avamere. Moonsilver leaned against her. He laid his head in her lap. Aw, Avamere nuzzled him. "Maybe he'll be stronger in the morning," Heart said aloud. Of course he would, she thought, as she stared into the embers of the fire. He had to be. Heart lay awake, worrying, listening to Moonsilver's breathing. Then sleep overcame her. But she slept uneasily. This time it was hunters who chased her across the rocky ground in her dreams. In the morning, Heart woke up suddenly, breathing hard. Then her dreams faded away. Except for her own pounding pulse, the cave was quiet. Moonsilver was asleep beside her. Avamere was standing over him, her eyes closed and her head low. Heart got to her feet. She peeked out the cave entrance, listening. Morning birds were singing. That meant there were no strangers in the forest. Heart turned to kneel beside Moonsilver. She touched him lightly. He did not awaken. His skin felt too warm beneath her hands. Fever? Heart bit at her lip. He wasn't stronger. He was weaker. And if the wound went bad, if it swelled and the flesh rotted, he could die. She tried to wake Moonsilver again. He opened his eyes, then closed them again. A terrible thought came to her. Every hunter carried 1 or 2 poisoned arrows for mountain lions or bears, dangerous animals that weren't easily killed. Heart stood up, feeling almost dizzy with fear. She went outside, trying to think. The treetops below her rolled like a green ocean in the breeze. Heart caught a distant glimpse of the Dairytown Road through the swaying branches. She took a long breath. The hunters would come back. They would search for the mysterious animal they had shot. Now that it was light out, they'd find her bare footprints in the unicorn's tracks, and the blood where Moonsilver had stood, trembling. Heart told herself it would be all right, so long as the hunters didn't see Moonsilver. The unicorn's hoofprints looked no different from any ordinary horses. The hunters would think that they had shot a horse colt. But then what would they do? Would they keep looking? They might, if they had used poison and thought the animal had to be dead somewhere nearby. Or maybe they would ride back to Dunraven's castle and never tell anyone, afraid they had killed an old pony by mistake. Either way, it'd be safe to come back to the cave eventually, Heart thought. For now, it was a very dangerous place. Heart ducked back inside. Avamere was wide awake now, still standing close to Moonsilver. "Eat all you can," Heart whispered to the mare, piling dried grass beside her. Heart buried her fire ring with clean, dry sand and hid her cookpot. She had everything except her flint fire striker and 1 candle stub, and her coins. She knotted them up in a strip of cloth. Then she took down her unfinished gate. Last, she used a leafy tree branch to smooth their tracks from the sandy floor. Pretty smart, huh? Walking slowly with Moonsilver between Heart and Avamere, they left the cave. The sun was warm, and it seemed to strengthen Moonsilver a little. It was still hard going. They walked close to the Dairytown Road, but stayed out of sight. Moonsilver would have fallen a dozen times if Heart and his mother hadn't been propping him up from both sides. Heart's arms ached by noon. By dusk, her legs hurt too, strained from bracing Moonsilver upright. Heart finally stopped, weary, in a stand of sycamore trees. They were close. She could see the shine of the blue river half a mile ahead. "We can rest," Heart whispered to Avamere. "We'll wait until dark to cross the bridge." Heart sighed. Moonsilver was too weak even to consider trying to swim the river. They had to go through the village. Heart settled Moonsilver on a bed of leaves. He sank to the ground, his eyes closing. Avamere stood over him. Heart curled up beside Moonsilver, worry numbing the pain of hunger in her stomach. She lay silently thinking. They would have to go straight up Crosswater Street, right through town. The shops would all be empty and closed, but there were some houses, too. Suddenly, the clopping of hooves broke the silence of the night. Heart caught her breath and opened her eyes. The moon had risen full and bright. Heart lay perfectly still, listening as the hoofbeats got closer. "Stop following me!" Heart flinched at the sound of the low, furious voice. She got to her feet. Through the trees she saw the shadowy shape of an old flat-bedded farmer's wagon. The oak wheels were sun-bleached, almost shining in the moonlight. The horse drawing it was sway-backed. Heart glanced at Avamere. The mare's head was high, her nostrils flared. Moonsilver was still asleep. His breathing was deep and slow. "Go back," the man said over his shoulder. Heart leaned close to Avamere. "Be still," she breathed. "Be quiet." Heart heard the creaking of old wood as the wagon passed. Then she listened hard. The silence stretched out. There was no sound of footsteps. Nothing. Whoever the man had been arguing with must have followed him. Heart closed her eyes again and tried to rest. When she opened them, it was still dark, but Heart sensed it was time to go. She sat up. Avamere lowered her head, touching Moonsilver's back with her muzzle. The colt moved a little. "We have to be careful," Heart whispered. Moonsilver shivered, the skin on his shoulders and back as though there were some summer flies biting him. Then he opened his eyes. Avamere nuzzled him again. Moonsilver lurched up awkwardly, stumbling against his mother. The stained bandage was tight over his wound, but Heart could see dark streaks in his white coat. It was still bleeding. "Wait here," Heart said, reaching out to pat Avamere's scarred forehead gently. "Do you understand? Stay hidden." The unicorn man looked into Heart's eyes. Heart turned, making her way through the trees. She looked both directions down the hard-packed dirt road. It was empty. It was hard to get Moonsilver moving again. His leg had stiffened. Avamere and Heart braced him up as well as they could. Slowly, stopping every few minutes, they made their way eastward. Heart glanced at the sky. It wasn't getting light yet, and the moon was still high. Maybe, with luck, they could make it through the town without being seen. For a second, Heart imagined Ruth Oakes's warm kitchen, and her eyes flooded with tears. A short, sharp bark startled her into an abrupt stop. Moonsilver nearly fell, and Heart struggled to steady him. A patchy-colored puppy was standing stiff-legged in front of them, peering at them in the moonlight. Now Heart understood whom the wagoner had been scolding. She looked past the pup, squinting. The road was empty, and there was no sound of hooves or footsteps. "Come here," she whispered to the puppy, kneeling down. The pup tilted his head. "Come on," Heart said quietly. "I won't hurt you." The puppy still didn't move. Heart heard Avamere blow out a soft, fluttery breath. The puppy whined, a sad, reed-thin sound. Then he lifted his head and the moonlight lit his face. One of the puppy's eyes was deep brown. The other was light blue. Heart knelt and reached out to the puppy. He bolted into her arms. He was shaking, whimpering. He was almost too big to hold. Avamere let out a longer, noisier breath. Heart looked at her. "I know." Avamere stamped a forehoof. Heart stood up, gently sliding the pup back to the ground. He let out another sharp bark. "Kip?" Heart said, making the sound into a word. I'm sorry, but you can't come with us, Kip. Hart knew she had no choice. If the pup barked going through town, he'd start every dog in Ash Grove howling. Someone would come look. Moonsilver had lowered his head, his muzzle nearly touching the ground again. Hart moved away slowly, making sure the colt was leaning against Avamere. She clapped her hands suddenly, startling the puppy into leaping backward. Shoo! The puppy scrambled to get away from her. Hart's eyes filled with tears. She hated scaring him. But what else could she do? It was too dangerous to let him follow them through Ash Grove. If she could have carried him, but she couldn't. Go on, she said, clapping once more. Go! The puppy ran this time, disappearing into the darkness of the trees. Hart took her place by Moonsilver and they began to walk. She glanced back. The pup wasn't coming. Her eyes stung and overflowed. She freed one hand long enough to swipe at the tears. Then she went on. Join me next time while I read Part 2 of The Silver Thread from the Unicorn Secret series.